Ben was sitting on the couch trying to process what Jane had just told him. She'd been away for a whole month on a business trip. It sounded serious. She explained that her boss had given her a critical project to oversee from far away. Ben felt a mix of pride and longing. They hadn't spent that much time apart since getting married. They were a young couple, just 3 years into marriage, renting a modest little house on the outskirts of Dallas. It wasn't much, but it was cozy. They were both career-oriented, trying to save for a down payment on their first home. Despite the long hours at work, they were in it together, and it made their bond feel solid. But lately, Ben had noticed a change in Jane. She was laser-focused on her career, working late, and taking every opportunity to advance. Why the sudden ambition? "Jane," he asked, half-jokingly. She grinned, raising an eyebrow because she was going to earn more than him. Competition. He'd laughed it off before, saying it was just playful banter. But now, watching her pack with a determined look in her eye, he wondered if there was more truth to it than he'd realized. Jane had always been driven, but this was something else. She'd talked about how her ambition was being noticed and how she was taking on tougher projects. She'd even hinted that she wanted to prove herself. Ben felt a surge of pride. He loved that she was so capable and so committed as she packed. "I'll be expecting big checks to hit the account soon." Then MCO in the making, Jane laughed and rolled her eyes. "You just wait," she said. "By the time I'm back, you'll be telling everyone your wife's the star employee." Her humor and confidence left him feeling reassured and excited for her. She gave him a warm hug, and for a moment he felt certain everything would be just fine. The morning of Jane's departure felt bittersweet for Ben. She'd packed her suitcase with precision, checking her passport and other essentials before she finally zipped it shut. Spain for a month sounded like a dream when she told him. He couldn't help but feel a small pang of jealousy. Spain had been a long-time dream of his, but they'd always been too busy or too short on money to make it happen. "Spain sounds amazing," he said, giving her a supportive smile. "I hope you get a little time to see some of it." Jane grinned, brushing his hand before picking up her bags. Maybe a souvenir, a taste of the culture they shared, a lingering kiss at the door, and good luck with everything. He gave her hand a squeeze and said, "Thanks, Ben. Love you." She replied with one last warm look before turning and walking away. The first week without Jane went by in a quiet routine. They exchanged texts now and then with Jane, sending quick updates about work and how busy she was. It reassured him that things were going smoothly, even though he missed her more than he'd anticipated by the time the weekend. Ben decided to do a big grocery run with Jane away. The fridge was emptier than usual, so he went to one of the big supermarkets across town. As he wandered the aisles checking items off his list, he found himself distracted. His mind slipped back to the empty house he'd been coming home to all week. He turned into an aisle looking for coffee when he heard a familiar voice call his name. "Hey there," he looked up, surprised to see Megan. She was an old friend from college who always seemed to have, "Megan, it's been a while," he said, smiling. "How have you been?" "I just got back from Miami." "Funny running into you. Are you back already?" Ben frowned, caught off guard. Back from where?" She tilted her head, looking at him curiously. "Miami? You know, with Jane. I ran into her a few days ago with a guy. She told me you were down there for the week with some friends to unwind." Ben's smile froze. He forced a chuckle, trying to cover his shock. "Oh right, yeah. Just been busy. Work's been hectic." "It's been hectic since we got back." Megan's face softened. "Well, don't let it get to you too much. Anyway, it was nice to run into her, and I'm glad you guys got to relax a bit. Take care, Ben." She waved and hurried off down the aisle, leaving Ben rooted in place. He barely remembered how he'd finished up his shopping. Megan's words replayed over and over in his mind on the drive home. Each time, they left him more confused. Jane was supposed to be in Spain, but Megan had seen her in Miami with a man the rest of the weekend. Ben couldn't make sense of what Megan had said. Each time he tried to rationalize it, another wave of doubt hit him. Was it a mistake? Had Jane's job sent her to Miami for a short while? Or had Megan just seen someone who looked like her? The more he tried to shake the thought, the more it clung to him. By Monday morning, he couldn't take it any longer. He needed to know the truth. He decided to call Jan's office, not as her husband, but as someone else entirely. As he dialed the number, his hands were shaking. "Good morning, Comet Technologies. How may I direct your call?" A young voice chirped on the other end. Ben took a deep breath, deepening his voice and trying to sound casual. "Hi there, I'm an old client of Jan's. We lost touch and I'm trying to get back in contact with her. Could you connect me with her?" The secretary paused for a moment. "Oh, I'm sorry, sir. But Jane is on leave right now. She'll be back in about 3 weeks." Ben froze. His heart was pounding. "Oh, really? I hadn't heard. Is everything okay?" "Oh yes," the secretary replied cheerfully. "Her husband hurt his leg or something and she's taking some time off to help him recover, which is really thoughtful of her. Can I leave a message for when she's back?" Ben gripped the phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. "No, thank you," he managed, then hung up abruptly. He slumped back into his chair trying to process what he'd just heard. 3 weeks of vacation, not Spain, not work, not even a business trip. She told her office she was home with. The story was so well crafted that it almost seemed believable. But here he was, perfectly healthy with no idea that his own wife had told such an elaborate lie. Ben felt a burning fury rising within him. It was all becoming painfully clear. Jane had lied to him, created an entire fantasy to cover her tracks. Megan's story about Miami, and now this, it all pointed to the same sickening conclusion. She was with someone else, living it up on a vacation while he sat at home. He was waiting like a fool, feeling a mix of anger and heartbreak. His first instinct was to call her and demand answers. He wanted to shout down the phone and tell her exactly what he thought of her betrayal. But a voice in his head held him back. He couldn't just confront her without thinking. Jane was smart and he knew she'd be ready to spin a new lie in an instant if he didn't have proof. Worse, a direct confrontation could lead them straight to divorce, which would mean splitting everything, including the Ben muttered to himself, down payment savings, calm down. He took a deep breath and let the anger simmer, directing it into cold, calculated thoughts. She was going to pay for what she'd done. He would make sure of it, but he'd have to be smart about it. He had to think before he acted. Please subscribe to the channel. The realization of Jane's betrayal lingered like a bitter taste. Ben couldn't sit through the rest of the workday. Each hour ticking by felt like an eternity. By noon, he'd made up his mind. He needed a plan, and he needed it now. He told his boss he wasn't feeling well and asked to leave early. He searched for the best-rated divorce lawyer he could find online, made the call, and within an hour he was sitting across from an attorney named Michael Grant. Michael was a calm, calculating man in his 40s with a sharp gaze that told Ben he had navigated messy situations like this more than a few times. As Ben recounted everything, Jane's story about Spain, Megan's unexpected revelation, Michael listened. About Miami and the big fib she told her boss, Michael listened closely, taking notes when Ben finished. He leaned back in his chair, looking serious. "You've got 2 options here, Ben. First, you can wait and gather solid evidence. If you can catch her in the act, it'll strengthen your case. This would let us keep your assets intact and even get damages for infidelity." Ben's fists clenched at the thought of waiting. He asked, his voice tight. Michael nodded. "You act quickly and protect what matters most to you. Your primary concern is the down payment savings. We can take steps to secure those funds without tipping Jane off. Once the funds are secure, we file for divorce and she returns to find her options limited." Ben felt a sense of relief mixed with resolve. "The savings is the only thing I care about. It's my money too. I won't let her take a cent of it if I can help it." The lawyer's eyes gleamed with "okay, so we need to get moving on this." Here's what you need to do over the next hour. Michael has come up with a plan that will let Ben move the funds into an account that's only in his name. The idea is to make sure that Jane can't access it or lay claim to it once the divorce proceedings start. They went over the details, making sure that every step is discreet. The lawyer told him that the sooner he can get started, the better the outcome will be. The next few days were a whirlwind of preparation. Ben spent his evenings going over their finances in detail, moving funds around and following Michael's advice to the letter with each move. He felt a strange sense of satisfaction, as though he was taking the first step towards reclaiming his life by reclaiming the money. By the end of the week, his lawyer had finished drafting the divorce papers. The divorce papers and the savings were safely out of Jane's reach. All that was left was to wait for her return. When she walked through the door, expecting life as usual, she would be greeted with the reality she'd created. Jane stepped out of the taxi with a spring in her step and her skin glowing. With a perfect tan and still buzzing from her business trip, she spent her days on warm beaches, late nights, and enjoyed the kind of carefree freedom she hadn't felt in years. Back on her own street, she was running through the lines she'd practiced, thinking about how exhausting the work had been. Her work had been the tight deadlines, and how Spain's beautiful scenery had been wasted on her because she'd barely had a chance to see it as she approached the house. She noticed a car parked in the driveway that she didn't recognize, which seemed a bit odd. Maybe Ben had a friend over, she thought, shrugging it off. She dug her keys out of her bag and went to unlock the door. She took her keys out of her purse and went to unlock the door, but before she could slide the key into the lock, the door swung open. There was a woman, maybe in her mid-30s, with a warm, almost pitying smile beside her. There was also a young boy, around 10, wearing a backpack and clutching a basketball under one arm. The boy looked at Jane was curious, while the woman's gaze held something else entirely, something that made Jane's heart skip a beat. Jane was taken aback and forced a polite smile. Excuse me, who are you and what are you doing in my house? The woman's smile widened, but her eyes stayed sharp. Oh, you must be Jane, she said brightly, as if Jane greeted an old friend, but her mind was racing. She opened her mouth to say something, but the woman continued. Ben mentioned you'd be stopping by to pick up your things, she said. I'm Dana, and this is my son Lucas. She gestured around the hallway. Her voice was light but steady. We just moved in, she added. Jane felt like the floor had dropped from under her. She released her suitcase, which landed with a thud on the porch. Her eyes were wide with shock, and her mouth worked soundlessly. She moved in, managing to croak, feeling as though she was caught in some terrible dream. What do you mean you moved in? Ben didn't tell you, Jane thought, tilting her head as if considering her words carefully. He was so thoughtful, making sure everything was ready for Lucas and me to feel right at home. I'm just here to keep everything cozy for him. You know, like a fresh start. Jane's heart was racing and her hands felt numb as she gripped the door frame, unable to process what she was hearing. Her mind was scrambling for some logical explanation. This was her house, their house. Ben hadn't mentioned anything like this in the few brief messages they'd exchanged while she was away. She stammered, her voice barely above a whisper, "This is my home. I'm Ben's wife." Dana's expression softened, but there was a glint in her eye. It was clear to Jane that this woman knew exactly what was going on. Oh, I know, Dana replied gently, as if comforting her. Jane's hand shook as she pulled out her phone and she called Ben's number, and with each unanswered ring, her world seemed to crumble a little more. Finally, she heard his voice on the other end. Ben, it's Jane. I come home and there's some stranger in our house with her kid. What is this? Ben's response was calm and almost too calm down. Jane, I ended our lease. The house belongs to Dana and her son now. I figured it was time to make a clean break. Your things are in the garage. He continued, coolly, Dana was nice enough to let me leave them there for you until you got back. You might want to thank her. Jane felt her pulse pounding in her ears. This couldn't be happening. She tried to gather herself, clinging to some scrap of dignity, but her voice cracked as she sputtered, Ben, what do you mean you ended the lease? Why would you? Ben cut her off. His tone was as cold as she'd ever heard it. "Oh, and one more thing," he said almost conversationally. There are divorce papers on the passenger seat of your car. Sign them whenever you're ready, honey. I'll see you in court." Before Jane could say anything else, the line clicked and the call ended. She tried to redial, but her calls didn't go through. He had blocked her. She looked down at her phone. In stunned silence, the reality of the situation hit her like a wave and she burst into tears. Dana, who had watched the whole scene with a calm, almost sympathetic look, stepped forward and placed a gentle hand on Jane's shoulder. "I'm really sorry you're going through this," she said softly. "Your things are right there in the garage. I hope you find what you need, Jane." She couldn't even look at her. Her mind was a chaotic mess of disbelief, anger, and humiliation. She clutched her suitcase and stumbled toward the garage, where she found her things hastily packed into a few boxes in her car. Her hand shook as she picked up the folder. She stared at the bold black letters on the front of the divorce papers and let out a shaky breath. Tears spilled down her cheeks in one cruel moment. Her whole world had been ripped apart without another glance back. She climbed into her car, clutching the wheel as she tried to steady herself. She needed to go somewhere, to talk to someone. Who could help her make sense of this nightmare? She took a deep breath, started the car and drove away to her friend's place, tears streaming down her face the whole way. 5 days after the bombshell of Jane's return, Ben found himself in the courthouse facing the woman he'd once vowed to love forever, the divorce proceedings having barely begun. The proceedings were still underway when the tension between them became obvious. Jane was angry and felt blindsided by how he'd managed to protect the money they'd saved together. She hadn't expected him to act so decisively, so her frustration boiled over and she resorted to ugly accusations, even calling him abusive and aggressive. Ben kept his cool, though, and stayed calm. He'd come prepared, and his lawyer had advised him to stay calm and not respond to any of Jane's outbursts. Her angry words and scathing glares bounced off him as he kept his focus on one thing: his future without her. By the end of the hearing, he felt drained, but he was determined to get some time to himself that evening. Ben met up with some old friends from college at a local bar. They settled into a booth, catching up and sharing stories. Ben only hinted at his divorce, offering vague details about irreconcilable differences, but nothing more. His friends sensed he wasn't ready to talk about it in more detail. They respected his privacy and shared a few laughs, trading stories about work and the usual banter that comes with old friendships. As the night wore on, one of the guys, Ryan, excused himself to the restroom. Ben leaned back, eyeing him as he left. Ryan looked tan, almost unnaturally so, and grinning, Ben joked, "Hey John, what's up with Ryan? He looks like he's just come out of a tanning bed or something. Or maybe he's using the bronzer like a bodybuilder before a competition." John chuckled, rolling his eyes. "Yeah, he does look like a wannabe beach bum, doesn't he? I think he's been on some vacation with a girl. Miami maybe." He didn't say much, just avoided the subject for now. Something in Ben clicked when he heard Miami. It stirred a feeling he couldn't ignore. He turned to Jan, his expression hardening. "Wait, you said Miami?" Jan replied, sensing Ben's sudden shift in mood. "Why?" Ben's jaw tightened, because Jane was supposedly in Miami. Ben's eyes widened in realization. "Wait, are you saying that maybe Ryan and Jane were together?" John's expression hardened. "That's a serious betrayal. What happened to our code?" Ben thought. If Ryan had been Jane's secret vacation companion, then the truth might be. Sitting right in Ryan's phone, a plan began to form. Ben leaned forward and nodded toward the bathroom. "Listen, I've got an idea. When he comes back, I need him to unlock his phone. I'll grab it just long enough to look. Think you can hold him if things get ugly?" John smirked and nodded. "I've got your back." A few minutes later, Ryan came back and sat down, grabbing his drink. Ben kept his tone light and feigned interest, asking Ryan for some vacation tips. I'm thinking of going somewhere warm myself, he said. Ryan was caught off guard and chuckled nervously. Oh yeah, man. You know, just the usual spots, he replied. Ben pressed him for more. Show me some of those, he said. Ryan reluctantly pulled out his phone and unlocked it to scroll through his photos, but before he could react, Ben reached over and snatched the phone from his hand in one swift motion. What are you doing? Ryan said, reaching for the phone. Others moved in to block him. Just a quick peek, buddy, Ben said, his voice cold as he quickly scanned the gallery. His heart sank as he found exactly what he'd feared, a series of photos of Ryan and Jane laughing together on a beach, sharing drinks at a bar. Their smiles were too familiar, their poses too close. He flipped through photo after photo, each one made Ryan's betrayal even more obvious. Ryan's panicked voice faded into the background as the full truth hit Ben like a tidal wave. Without hesitation, Ben began forwarding every photo of Ryan and Jane from the phone to his own. The images were a painful confirmation of what he'd feared, beach scenes of them lounging together, clinking glasses at bars, laughing, even selfies with arms around each other that showed how close they were. Ben, come on, give it back. Ryan stammered, reaching for the phone, but John and the others held him firmly in his seat. Their faces were stony with disgust. This group of friends had a code of loyalty that they'd sworn to uphold since college. They'd all dated and married, and there was one rule that they'd all agreed on: never touch another friend's girl. But Ryan had apparently crossed that line. Ben continued to scan the phone, opening the messaging app and quickly finding a long thread of exchanges between Ryan and Jane. He felt his stomach twist as he skimmed through the messages, which included flirty texts, late-night conversations, and thinly veiled excuses about her business trip. He sent everything to his phone, ensuring he had undeniable proof. Finally, Ben tossed the phone back to Ryan, saying, "Here you go. Thanks for the memories." The tension at the table was palpable as the rest of the guys turned their attention to Ryan. Their faces were hard with anger and disappointment. One of the guys, Nate, shook his head in disgust. He said, "We had a code. We all agreed that you don't go near another man's wife. But you threw that all out for what?" Ryan sputtered. His face flushed. "It's not what it looks like." "Save it," Jan cut him off sharply. "We're looking at the pictures." "Ryan, it's exactly what it looks like. I never thought you'd do something like this." Ryan tried to defend himself, but his words stumbled as he attempted to excuse his actions. "It wasn't serious." "I didn't think it was serious." Ben interrupted, his voice as cold as steel. He locked eyes with Ryan, a faint hint of anger in his otherwise calm expression. "You didn't think about loyalty, friendship, or honor. You just thought about yourself." The group sat in an uncomfortable silence. The weight of Ryan's betrayal settled over them. Finally, Ben stood and looked down at Ryan with a grim realization. "You know, Ryan. A while ago, I would have knocked you out for this, but I don't need to. I know you just go running to the cops crying about how I hurt you." Ryan flinched, but Ben only shook his head. "So go to hell, Ryan. As far as I'm concerned, you're a rat, a stranger." With that, Ben turned and walked away, and the rest of the group followed, leaving Ryan sitting alone, his face a mixture of Ben had what he needed that night: the photos, the messages, all the proof he could ask for at the next court hearing. He presented every last detail, laying it out plainly for everyone to see, including Jane. She knew that her last shred of defense was gone when she saw the photos and messages. The divorce was swift after that. Ben retained their savings, and Jane's betrayal left her with little leverage. After the divorce was finalized, Jane and Ryan tried to keep their relationship going, clinging to whatever had brought them together in the first place. But as you might expect, the thrill quickly faded. Within 2 months, they drifted apart. The weight of their actions and the loss of their reputations left their bond shallow and hollow. Meanwhile, Ben was free and life moved forward. Mutual friends and acquaintances had learned about what happened, and many of them chose to distance themselves. They cut themselves off from Jane and Ryan. They'd gone too far and there was a lot of negative reaction. No one could look at them the same way for Ben. The betrayal had been hard to take, but he knew he was better off. He'd gained clarity, peace, and a fresh start. He was finally free from a marriage built on lies. He took a deep breath and let it out slowly, knowing that the future now belonged fully to him. If you enjoyed the story, please subscribe to the channel. I wish you a great mood and good luck.